Did you know that Grandma could make cakes juicier, bread crispier, and cookies fresher longer with a few simple hand motions, completely without modern kitchen machines? Many of these hacks are almost forgotten today, yet they decide flop or masterpiece in your bakery. In this video, I show you 31 genius baking secrets from Grandma's times that you'll wish you had known much earlier. If you don't want to miss Grandma's secrets, subscribe now. And let's get started right away. Potato water for yeast dough. Back then, nothing was wasted. When the potatoes were cooked, one carefully kept the water. In it stuck an unassuming secret that made every bread better. The starch in the water fed the yeast, and the dough rose as if it had gotten a small piece of magic. The result was a bread with soft crumb, tender bite, and a freshness that lasted days. Whoever looks closely notices also the difference in taste, lightly full-bodied, and at the same time gentle. Important was only patience. The water had to be lukewarm, otherwise the heat would have destroyed the delicate yeast cells. Some added a spoon of sugar and swore that the loaves became even airier, so even cooking water became the source of true baking art. Vinegar in short crust pastry. Short crust pastry has its peculiarities. Whoever works it too much soon feels the resistance. The crumb becomes hard and loses its fine tenderness. Grandma had an unassuming solution in the drawer for that. A small splash of vinegar into the ice-cold water before it comes under the flour, and the dough obeys suddenly, as if tamed. The acid weakens the gluten that otherwise acts like a net, and transforms the dough into something wonderfully crumbly that acts supple when rolling out. The base succeeds crumbly, but holds at the same time if it should carry fruit or cream. So arose that balance that made pie bases crispy, but never hard. A drop of vinegar sufficed, and the dough was refined in mysterious way. Ice-cold water in the dough. Cold was the secret of every bakery. When water was so cool that one saw the breath steaming over it, the dough began to live. The butter stayed firm, let small layers arise that lifted to wafer-thin sheets in the hot oven. Grandma always had a jug standing in the fridge, sometimes even with ice pieces in it. She knew that every degree less decided on the lightness of a cake. A dough stirred with ice-cold water didn't stick, let itself roll out supple, and yet held stand. As soon as the heat reached it, the full aroma unfolded, and a crust that splintered like thin glass. An unassuming knack, and yet the key to true baking art. Bring all ingredients to room temperature. A good dough needs harmony. If eggs come ice cold from the fridge and butter hard as stone, then every ingredient fights against the other. Grandma knew that warmth in the right measure works wonders. She put the ingredients ready in time, let them rest until they had adapted to the kitchen. Then everything connected effortlessly. Butter melted gently into the flour. Eggs laid softly in addition, milk joined without resistance. So arose a dough that didn't stall, didn't curdle, but became supple and locked air. In the oven, it thanked with a fine crumb, light as clouds. Whoever shows patience and gives the ingredients time harvests pastry that delights heart and senses alike. Warm eggs in warm water. When the lust for baking came, it often had to go fast. No one wanted to wait until the eggs became warm by themselves. So Grandma resorted to a simple hack. A bowl, some lukewarm water, and already the eggs bathed like in a small spa. 10 minutes sufficed, and they were ready for the dough. This small detour saved time and brought at the same time great benefit, because warm eggs let themselves beat easier, connected effortlessly with butter and sugar, and gave the cake more airiness. Especially biscuit profited from it. It rose higher and stayed, nevertheless, feather light. From an everyday emergency solution became so a small ritual that made every baking a bit safer and more reliable. Dust dried fruits or nuts with flour. Raisins, nuts, or chocolate have their own will. Hardly in the dough, they seek the way down and collect at the bottom. Grandma knew the hack that brought order into this chaos. A touch of flour, nothing further. The pieces were turned in it until they were coated like with fine dust. Then they were allowed back into the bowl. Suddenly they held themselves in the dough, floated almost in it instead of sinking. So every bite became a small feast, evenly distributed, no naked places, no heavy lumps. This hand motion was unassuming and yet decisive. Whoever tried it once understood immediately why Grandma's cakes were never one-sided, but perfect, balanced to the last crumb. Let fruit draw with sugar before baking. Juicy fruit in the cake was a feast for Grandma, but she knew also the danger. Too much liquid quickly transformed the bottom into a soft, heavy mass. Therefore, she resorted to a simple knack. Before the fruits were allowed into the form, they were sprinkled with sugar and left standing for some minutes. The sugar drew the juice out, collected it in a bowl, and left the fruit itself more concentrated, more aromatic, and lighter. The excess juice could be poured off or bound with some starch and used as fine sauce. In the cake, the bottom stayed dry and the filling fruity. So arose a pastry that held stand and at the same time scented after summer and sweetness. A small hand motion with great effect. Protect base against moisture. A cake bottom should remain steadfast even if the filling is ever so juicy. Exactly therein lay the art that many bakers mastered back then. Grandma reached for simple means that everyone had in the house. A thin veil of flour, a few breadcrumbs, sometimes also ground nuts. Sometimes she sprinkled sugar over the dough that melted in the oven and transformed into a tender caramel-like layer. So the bottom stayed dry and got at the same time a new aroma, lightly roasted and sweetish. Whoever cut a piece heard a quiet cracking before the fork glided through the fruit. This small secret made from an ordinary cake a pastry with character. So simple, so effective that one asked oneself why not everyone did it like that. Spoon flour instead of scoop. Sometimes the measuring decides victory or defeat in the bakery. Whoever dips the cup deep into the flour box presses the powder together and carries much more into the dough than thought. The result is a cake that lies heavy in the stomach and has lost every lightness. Grandma took the time to spoon the flour carefully with a spoon into the cup, loose, almost like snow that gently falls to the ground. Then she smoothed the surface, without pressing, so the amounts matched, so the balance fitted. A hand motion, unassuming and yet decisive. For every gram, too much changes the character of a pastry. Precision was her ingredient and one tasted it. Press brown sugar. Brown sugar was for Grandma more than just sweetness. It brought that moist depth that made a cookie chewy and a cake its soft crumb. But only if one measured it right. Loose scooped into the cup, the end was missing exactly what made it special. So she pressed it firm, so it detached like a small block when turning. This firm hand was no coincidence. It followed a rule that recipes trusted. Every gram counted, every compression gave the dough the right hold. Whoever measures like that feels at the first bite the difference, the caramelly, the juicy, the melting. A small pressure, and the whole world of taste changed. Level baking powder and baking soda exactly. An unassuming teaspoon could decide the fate of a cake. Baking powder or baking soda were never allowed to wander into the bowl by eye. Grandma took the spoon, stroked it smooth with the knife, and only then gave the powder to the flour. So simple, so strict, because too much let the dough first jubilantly rise, and shortly thereafter, sadly, collapse. Too little, on the other hand, made it heavy and dense, as if a stone lay in the oven. Precision was here no luxury, but necessity. Whoever followed this hand motion got even airy crumb, a dough that held what it promised. A small ritual with great effect. Every time the oven confirmed that accuracy in baking is a law. Sift dry ingredients. The sieve stood ready at hand back then. Hardly a dough arose without this step. Grandma let the flour trickle through, light and airy like snowflakes. Thereby, lumps dissolved, baking powder and salt distributed evenly, and the mass took air that later let the cake rise in the oven. Whoever looked more closely noticed that already the movement of sifting changed the scent, as if the flour was freshly awakened. A dough from sifted ingredients connected gentler without resistance, and gave a crumb that was fine and tender in the mouth, melted. This hand motion cost only minutes, made but the difference between heavy pastry and a cake that passed light and elegant on the tongue. Work with whisk instead of sieve. If the flour sieve was missing, Grandma reached for the whisk. A large bowl, a few quick movements, and the flour acted suddenly lighter. The whisk tore lumps open, lifted the powder, and let air in, almost as if a gust of wind passed through. Salt and baking powder disappeared evenly in it. Nothing remained at one place. The dough that arose afterward connected without effort, supple and loose. For muffins or stirred cakes, this method was completely sufficient, and it saved time. Whoever swung the whisk vigorously noticed how the sound changed. Dull scraping gave way to a brighter tone. Simple means, cleverly used, made the difference. Exactly such small hand motions let baking become an almost playful process. Start cake in cold oven. Not every cake needs a hot start. Some develop their magic only when they slowly wake up with the heat. Grandma put sand cakes and heavy stirred cakes simply into the cold oven, turned the regulator, and let time work. While the temperature rose, the dough set, lifted evenly, and remained moist inside. Outside, a crust formed that burst open like a small landscape, golden brown and crispy. Whoever opened the oven too early risked a collapse, so the door remained closed until the structure stood. The result was unmistakable. A cake that had proudly grown in height, with a crumb so fine that every piece melted on the tongue. A proof for patience and experience. Use baking stone or fireclay plate. A wood oven was not to be found in every kitchen, but the taste of such a bread remained unforgettable. To come closer to this ideal, one got a baking stone or a heavy fireclay plate into the oven. They devoured the heat literally and gave it later explosively to the dough. When the dough slid on the hot surface, one heard a quiet hiss, and immediately the crust began to work. Grandma sprinkled often some flour or semolina on the stone so the bread didn't stick and got the typical rustic bottom. So succeeded in the modern oven, a result that reminded of baking days in the old village bakery. A piece of tradition, tangible in one's own oven. Supply oven with steam. Whoever has bitten once into an oven-fresh crust that was at the same time crisp and gleaming has unconsciously tasted the steam. Grandma put when bread baking a metal bowl in the oven, poured water in, and let the clouds work. The dough got the chance to unfold freely before the shell hardened. First it expanded, then it set the crust, thin, crispy, with this typical shine that catches the eye immediately. Some swear today by spray bottles, but the principle is the same. Moisture makes bread more beautiful, bigger, more seductive. A plain hack that forms from flour and water a masterpiece. Every bakery uses it, and already earlier one knew how decisive it was. Rotate baking pans and switch levels. The old stoves had their own head. Back it was hotter, front it remained cooler, top browned faster than bottom. Whoever knew that could react. Grandma pulled the sheet halfway through the baking time carefully out, turned it once around itself, and pushed it back. Had she several forms in the oven, she switched top and bottom, so every cake got its fair share of heat. The door remained open only for a moment, so the warmth didn't escape. In the end stood a pastry that was evenly browned, without pale places, without burnt edges. A simple hand motion that has not lost importance even in the modern oven. Evenness is no coincidence. It is the result of attention. Toothpick test. A cake betrays its condition not at first glance. The surface can deceive, gleam golden brown, and yet the middle is still raw. Therefore, Grandma stuck a plain wooden stick into the thickest spot of the dough. If it came dry out, or only with a few crumbs, she knew the moment had come. Still moist mass stuck to it. The cake got a few minutes grace period. This small test cost nothing, was quickly done, and yet more reliable than any display at the oven. So one escaped the one error that could make all effort naught. In the end stood a pastry evenly baked through, juicy but not raw. A simple toothpick became the guard over the success. Tap brownie pan. Some cakes live from the air, brownies, on the other hand, from the weight. To not become like a dry stirred cake, it needed a small shock moment. Grandma pulled the sheet after half the baking time out, lifted it, and let it fall again with a firm blow on the oven edge. A dull tone, a short trembling, and already the air bubbles set in the dough. The surface got fine cracks. Inside the mass remained dense, almost creamy. This hand motion looked unassuming, but had great effect. Whoever bit once into such a brownie felt the soft middle, the gleaming crust, the contrast of tender and strong. A piece of chocolate in baking form, refined by a single blow. Chill cookie dough. Patience was in Grandma's kitchen no virtue, but an ingredient. Cookie dough was allowed to rest, wrapped and chilled, often overnight. What happened thereby one couldn't see, but one tasted it later. The flour soaked full slowly, the sugar dissolved, the butter became firm and held everything together. When the balls from the fridge wandered into the oven, they didn't run broadly apart, but stayed in shape. Outside, a golden edge arose. Inside, the middle remained soft, almost caramelly. The scent was more intense, the bite reminded of the best bakeries. A hand motion that hardly cost effort but made the difference. Whoever knew this hack baked no ordinary cookies anymore. Make vanilla sugar from pod remnants. Vanilla was precious, and nothing of it was allowed to be lost. When the pods were scraped out, the remnants didn't go in the trash, but in a glass of sugar. There they released their scent over weeks, quiet and steady, until the sugar itself smelled of vanilla. Grandma opened the glass and a sweet cloud rose, as if one had entered a bakery. With a spoon of it, she transformed simple stirred cake into a small feast. Cookies got depth, desserts a touch of luxury. The hack was plain, but genius, sustainable in addition. From something apparently worthless arose a stock that always stood ready. A glass vanilla sugar belonged in every kitchen, then as now. Protect cake edges with foil. A cake could look deceptive. At the edge, already dark. In the middle, still raw. Whoever overlooked that soon had a burnt wreath and a sticky middle. Grandma reached in such moments for a strip of aluminum foil. Gently, she laid it around the edge, as if hanging a mantle around the cake. The foil held the heat back, reflected it inward, where the dough still had to work. So the middle got time while the edge waited. In the end, stood an evenly baked cake, without hard crust, without cut-off places. A piece of attentiveness saved the whole work. This hack was unassuming, but it contributed to that Grandma's bakery never smelled of compromise, but of completion. Brush fresh bread with butter. If a fresh loaf came from the oven, the work was not over yet. Grandma put the pot with melted butter ready and brushed it gently over the hot crust. One heard the quiet crackling, saw how the surface gleamed, and felt how the scent changed. From strong and rustic became warm and inviting. The butter pulled immediately into the pores, made the crust softer, and gave it at the same time a tender aroma. A cut through the golden shell revealed a crumb that still steamed. This last hand motion lent the bread something festive, as if it was not only food, but a gift. So on the table stood not some loaf, but a small miracle. Stabilized meringue with starch. Meringue was always a small miracle. From plain egg whites arose a foam that acted like clouds, gleaming and light. But on humid days it lost form quickly, drops formed, the tips sagged. Grandma had a quiet weapon for that. She stirred a spoon of starch under the sugar before it trickled into the egg snow. The starch took the excess moisture up, made the mass firmer, and gave it hold. Beat by beat, the foam became denser, remained, but supple and gleaming. On the cake, throned now, a hood that didn't slide away, but stayed proud. A small addition, unassuming and effective, that made from fragile lightness a steadfast artwork. Sprinkle sugar on the dough base, and fruit cake could quickly become the trap. Above the fruit gleamed, below, however, the bottom transformed into a soft, heavy mass. Against that helped a hand motion that hardly noticed. Grandma sprinkled a wafer-thin layer of sugar on the raw dough, still before the fruits found their place. In the oven, the sugar melted, transformed into a tender caramel-like layer, and held the moisture back. The bottom stayed dry and got at the same time a new aroma, lightly roasted and sweetish. Whoever cut a piece heard a quiet cracking before the fork glided through the fruit. This small secret made from an ordinary cake a pastry with character. So simple, so effective that one asked oneself why not everyone did it like that. Portion cookie dough with 2 spoons. Before portioning aids from metal, one simply reached for 2 spoons. Grandma did it when the cookie dough was done and should wander on sheets. With 1 spoon, she took a thick dab. With the other, she pushed it gently on the sheet. Every heap had almost the same size. No sticky fingers, no chaos. Whoever dipped the spoons in between briefly in warm water noticed how easily the dough detached. On this way, whole sheet rows of even cookies arose that rose next to each other in the oven, golden brown and scented. It needed no devices, only a bit of skill. A simple hand motion that gave generations of Christmas cookies and Sunday cookies their shape and works reliably to this day. Save butter paper and use for greasing. In Grandma's kitchen, everything had its second purpose. Even the unassuming butter paper didn't land in the trash. It wandered folded into a small drawer or into the fridge until it was needed again. Shortly before baking, she fetched it out and stroked with it over the baking form. One heard the rustle of the paper, saw the fine shine that it left. No thick layers, no fat excess, only exactly as much as the dough needed later to loosen easily. It was frugal, practical, and genius at the same time. A remnant that seemed otherwise useless transformed into a tool that facilitated baking. So showed itself an attitude that shaped kitchen and everyday, quiet and sustainable at the same time. Cover cake with dish towel. A cake wasn't allowed to cool naked. Still warm, it came from the form, and immediately Grandma laid a thin dish towel over it. It was like a gentle mantle that caught the steam without crushing the cake. Under the towel, the surface stayed soft, the crumb juicy, nothing dried out. Whoever lifted the towel later felt still the residual warmth, smelled the sweetness that had collected. So the cake tasted not only fresh, it felt also fresh. Every bite remained tender, as if one had just taken it from the oven. A hand motion, plain and clever, that brought a piece of security on the table and kept every pastry alive longer. Cool biscuit upside down. A biscuit is a sensitive being. Hardly from the oven, it threatens to sink under its own weight. Exactly therefore, Grandma turned the form simply on the head. Sometimes she placed it over a glass bottle, sometimes on a grid, and the cake hung free in the air. The gravity that would otherwise press it down now held it in shape. While it slowly cooled, its height remained preserved, its pores fine and even. Whoever set the knife later saw a crumb that acted light as clouds and yet held stand. This hand motion may act unusual, but it preserved the airiness. So from a sensitive dough became a proud pastry that lent every plate dignity. Bake bread on hot stone or with semolina. A bread got its character not only through the dough, but also through the bottom. Grandma knew that and laid value on strong bottom heat. She had a heavy baking stone that she preheated long in the oven until it literally glowed. If she slid the dough on it, one heard a quiet hiss, and immediately the crust began to work. Had she no stone, she reached for semolina. She sprinkled it generously on the sheet so the grains formed a rough golden layer. The bread lay safe, didn't stick, and got a bottom crust that stood out crispy. Every bite told of this care. Simple bread, but with a depth that one never achieved without this hand motion. Spray oven with water. A bread got its crown only at the last moment. While it rose in the oven, Grandma reached for the spray bottle. A few quick bursts of water on the glowing walls. Already a cloud of steam pulled through the oven. The dough got so the chance to unfold freely before the shell hardened. First it expanded, then it set the crust, thin, crispy, with this typical shine that catches the eye immediately. Some swear today by spray bottles, but the principle is the same. Moisture makes bread more beautiful, bigger, more seductive. A plain hack that forms from flour and water, a masterpiece. Every bakery uses it, and already earlier one knew how decisive it was. So baked Grandma with simple knacks and great heart. If you want more such secrets, subscribe to our channel and don't miss any of our next baking stories. Much joy when trying, and bon appétit!